First of all, thank you, Bruna, for being here. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and where you come from?
Sure. My name is Bruna Lee, she, her pronouns. I teach English 1 and Ethnic Studies at Soda, which is a arts magnet within San Francisco Unified School District. I initially came into this work at Soda. I guess it started when I was in grad school at USF. I attended the Urban Education and Social Justice teaching program, and two of my mentors, Art Nelson Concordia and Nikhil Lod, um, had been working with the district, and we're part of the ethnic studies cohort, and we're trying to bring me into their work, which I'm very grateful for. And so here I am. I've been in this role for about, well, this is my second full year at SODA, but I've been teaching there since January of 2019.
Okay.
How did you find ethnic studies aside from getting in touch with Nikhil and some of your coworkers?
Yeah, so I was educated on the East Coast. I attended, high school, middle and high school in Massachusetts, and then I went to school in Rhode Island, and I studied literature and education. I've known I wanted to be a teacher since I was 16, and I was really passionate about my English classes and was really interested in, like creating opportunities where I would be able to dissect literature with young people in the same way that I was able to do in my English classes. Like, I really loved that experience. And when I first got to USF is really like how I got to learn more about the movement for ethnic studies here in the Bay Area. I had taken one ethnic studies class in college. It was a Latinx literature, so still, like within the literature realm, but with like an ethnic studies lens, and I really enjoyed that. And then, when I came out here, I had Art Nelson as one of my first professors, and then Nikhil was also my professor, and he was also teaching ethnic studies. And so I was really, and I had like a research position at USF where I could really kind of do whatever I wanted. Essentially, I was helping with some, with some research with my professor there, but I also could explore my own interests. And so I was really interested in learning more about the movement for ethnic studies. I think as someone who, who's not from the Bay, I really didn't know about it at all. Like, I had no idea about, about the third world, oh my gosh, why am I blanking out? The Third World Liberation Front
Yes.
strike, and I didn't really, know anything about that until I came out here. And so I would say that I found ethnic studies through the teaching community at USF, many of whom, had been working in SFUSD for many years, and many of those people have been fighting for ethnic studies within SFUSD and beyond for several years.
I see. Okay. Thanks for giving us that background. On to our next question. So, since you're a multi-subject educator, could you talk about the connection you see between, your English background into teaching, ethnic studies at Soda High School, and what sort of drives those two passions for you more specifically?
Sure. So I came into education because I was so passionate about literature.
Mm-hmm.
And so when, this position opened up at SODA, it initially was actually an English position, purely English. And it was, 2 sections of 10th grade English and 3 sections of 9th grade English. And at the time, I mean, we've continued to do this, but I think that year was like a pilot where they were trying to like infuse ethnic studies themes and concepts into English. And so, we were using kind of the scope and sequence of ethnic studies, right? The first unit of identity narrative, second unit systems and power, et cetera, et cetera. We're kind of following the curricular units of ethnic studies, but plugging in, English, like literature, and then plugging in, like whatever spiral of writing we were in.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I think it's interesting that I, was like hired specifically to teach English with an ethnic studies lens, when really, like, I think I've been doing ethnic studies work for several years. I just didn't know that that's what the Bay Area called it, right? I think like,
Mm.
I think, and a mentor of mine, Krisha Castrillo, who works at Balboa, you know, she talks about how ethnic studies is very like kind of Bay Area, but in the East Coast, I learned it. I was taught ethnic studies and like had that framework, but more it was within, right, like critical race theory and like post-colonial lens, which is still really, ultimately, I think ethnic studies, and whatever name you want to call it, it really is, a theory framework for centering the experiences and the knowledge of historically oppressed communities and peoples, and so I think that, whether or not I would have gotten a position that's like ethnic studies infused English, I still would have taught English the same way, right?
Yeah.
It's just thankfully now I actually have the support of the ethnic studies cohort at SFUSD.
Yeah.
Definitely. Oh, that brings up a question for me actually. So, because you teach English, right, and then you already have this ethnic studies lens over it, do you think comparatively the way that your English classes are structured are different than, say, like what I guess the standard English teacher would be teaching?
I
I guess it's kind of a
think,
broad
yeah,
question.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it depends on, who you were trained by, like when you were trained. I mean, I
Mm,
think the program at USF does teach, and especially in the urban education and social justice like track, like we are teaching English through that lens already. And so I think it really depends on like who's training you. And then again, right, like Krisha, who was my master teacher, was also a USF alum, and she's also been, an organizer in the Excelsior for years. And so I think it. I don't know how different, you know, my experience. I guess like, yes, my class is different from the quote unquote traditional classroom, but I would say that more and more, you know, the my classroom is becoming more of, right, like the
the
tradition
standard.
and the
Got it,
standard in
got
that
it.
sense. I
Ah,
think because of, like, right, the way that people are being trained. And I
right.
don't know too much about like this SF state like teaching program, but there are a lot of folks from USF that are going into SFUSD, and so I think, it's like a lot of people being trained by the same amazing educators.
Mm,
But yeah, I mean, if I were to compare my instruction to like someone who's been teaching for 20 plus years and didn't have, right, the language of culturally relevant, culturally responsive pedagogy, like all of that, I think it would have been different. But I don't know that it's actually specific to ethnic studies
mhm.
as much as it's really just a reflection of like like the language that the teaching field has used and evolved over the years.
Mm,
Oh, I like how you mentioned how kind of English classes are kind of moving into the way like how you're teaching through an ethnic studies lens. Do you see that more happening in the city and like in the Bay Area rather than, I guess, down south or in other states?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what public education looks like in the South, because
Yeah,
I
right.
don't really have like anyone there. But I think in comparison to like folks on the East Coast,
Mm-hmm.
definitely, I have a friend who, she's from Philly. She and I went through the USF program together. We actually bonded over the fact that we were both East Coasters, and it was like such a culture shock for us to come out here and be like, oh, I guess time really is relative, and like, what does it mean to start on time? And anyway, so, but she talks about how, she went back home after she completed the program, and she feels very politically isolated within her school.
Mhm.
And
mm,
I think that definitely within the city there are schools that are more progressive than others,
Right.
but you know, definitely like in comparison to the experiences that she's sharing in Philly, right? Like where, for example, you know, the term like trauma responsive teaching
Mm-hmm.
like is not really part of the vocabulary yet, you know, like it does show that there is, you know, a difference.
Right.
Um, and but I also would say that it depends on the school, right? Because there, you know, like I worked at a couple of schools in Boston and in Providence when I was in college there, and I definitely saw like a lot of you know, like a social justice mission to some of the schools, and so I think it does vary a lot.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So moving on to our next question, do you see ethnic studies as an appropriate and necessary response to the current issues we're facing, like in the Bay Area and
Sure.
broader?
Yeah, I mean, the way that more and more I like to think of ethnic studies is not so much like that specific class,
Right.
but really, right, like how can we center, you know, the experiences and the leadership and the knowledge of, you know, indigenous, people of color, queer folks, disabled folks, right? Folks um, who have been marginalized by the master narrative, right? Like how, and so it's really, you know, having every single student in San Francisco or the Bay Area or even the country take ethnic studies, like I'm sure that that would certainly, you know, help us develop greater empathy and understanding for a lot of like, you know, the dehumanizing acts that are happening in this country, as well as globally.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that more importantly, it's like it's implementing this framework and this narrative like through every single thing that we teach, right? And so like when I think about ethnic studies, it's like, yeah, it's you know, it's the day-to-day curriculum that I teach, but it's also, you know, the bigger like pedagogy of like being trauma responsive, being culturally responsive, and actually like having real life conversations with students about things that are impacting their everyday life. And that is also, I think, you know, especially important within SOTA, which is such a it's not a predominantly white school. Well,
Mm-hmm.
actually, yes, it is. I think it's like 42% white. Definitely, it's a much whiter and richer school in comparison to all the other SFUSD schools. And so I think what's especially important at a school like SOTA, right? And you could replace SOTA here with any other school and institution that receives so much money,
Mm-hmm.
right? And has and with families that have so much privilege and cultural capital and financial capital, right?
Right.
Like it's really important for these kids also to develop a sense of empathy and like to actually develop their skills as allies.
Right.
Because you know what I'm noticing this year, like teaching ethnic studies, and I think this year I have more white students in my more white and more middle class, you know, financially privileged students than I had last year.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of students who are, you know, kind of pointing out the fact that they weren't really aware about, you know, Black Lives Matter or like why Trump was, you know, like why Trump is such a what word should I use? Controversial figure, you know,
Uh-huh.
like because it didn't impact them. And so like, you know, I'm seeing that before they even step into my classroom, like right, they're having these realizations and these, you know, epiphanies that's like, oh yeah, I guess I should like do more research about like what people different from, you know, about like what people who are different from I am like experience on a day-to-day basis. And so I think ethnic studies, having that class, but also having that pedagogy would help, would, yeah, would very much help um, a lot of the political and social conflicts that we're having today, because it would really mean that we're able to see one another as human and be able to, um, you know, see see ourselves beyond just like what we look like, or what we dress like or what we believe in, but really actually understand like more deeply like who we are as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think what you just, your observations are not only a perfect segue into the next question, but also I think they're very accurate, right? Like, I think Michaela and I both went to Lincoln High School, so we have like a completely different ethnic demographic that went to our school, but I can definitely see that being something that a teacher would have to be cognizant of, right? Going into
Mm-hmm.
teaching a class and understanding that certain experience are not experienced equally, right? So to kind of move from that into this new sort of bubble, our next question is about implementing ethnic studies in the K through 12 curriculum. But I think maybe a more appropriate question for you is like, could you give us an example of what the ethnic studies twist does to a curriculum for students? Because I'm learning as we do these interviews, right, that it's not a like a ethnic buffet, right, as we had mentioned in some of our other interviews.
Right.
And it is really about, like, especially for you, particularly as an English teacher, it's kind of about picking apart these examples, right, and analyzing the examples of systems of oppression, institutions of oppression. So do you mind elaborating on maybe like what a lesson looks like for you through
Sure.
with that spin?
Sure. Yeah, and I think just to respond to a little bit of what you're saying, right? Like ethnic studies is not multicultural studies,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like ethnic studies is not like, oh, here's like diversity or like culture night, like let's all like, do a little expose about our cultures, right? It's
Yeah.
much deeper than that. I mean, I think that it is important. I mean, that's also important too, and it has its place, right? And I think it's like the more that we actually learn about one another's culture, the more that we understand like why people believe the things they do or why people act the way that they do. But yeah, to give an example of how I implement ethnic studies concepts and theories into my classroom, I think a good example of that is the a second unit, which is the informational writing unit. That's more centered on like nonfiction, and the name of the unit is Systems and Power, which is the same name that ethnic studies uses. And in the past 2 years, I guess let me just speak about last year. So last year, we looked at um, how young people of color interact with the justice system, and we read three. We had book clubs, and students could pick. They had the choice to read either the 57 Bus by Dashka Slater, which is a nonfiction. It's a nonfiction kind of investigative journalism text that uh, explores, right, a hate crime that happened on the 57 bus that had both the 57 bus in Oakland that had both, right, like several layers of, race, gender, class, ability, kind of all wrapped up into one, incident that kind of changed both of their lives. So that was one of the texts. The other text was The Hate You Give by Andrew
Mm-hmm.
Thomas, which is a young adult novel that discusses, a 16-year-old girl, Star, who, witnesses the murder of her best friend Khalil by a white cop, and kind of like what the ramifications are of, experiencing that trauma, and what it looks like to be in solidarity with the with the Black Lives Matter movement. The third book was called How I Went Down by Kekla Magoon, and it's a book that very much mirrors the case of Trayvon Martin.
Mm-hmm.
And it's told through multiple perspectives, and so you're kind of able to read from the perpetrator side, right, the person who's accused, but also like the different family members, cops, like everyone who's kind of like involved in the case. And so they read these three novels, and they don't read all three. They pick one of them to read, and then we would have like weekly book club meetings where students would kind of talk through the through the plot of the books, but also kind of connect what they're reading to the three systems, which are social, political, and economic, and seeing how, you know, each of these systems might play a role in what's happening in their book.
Mm-hmm.
And then the end of that that unit closed with a Socratic Seminar, where students, I provided some questions, but really a lot of the questions were like, you know, they came up with questions throughout the seminar as well, but the overarching question was back to, you know, how do young people of color interact with the justice system? And I think that conversation actually led to, you know, like what it's like to be a Black student at SOTA, you know, like what it means to, you know, to be a low-income student at SOTA, and how, right, like how Black students at SOTA and low-income students at SOTA can feel better supported.
Mm.
And all of that was really, I mean, especially the Socratic Seminar really is very much driven by what they're reading, but also what they're experiencing in their day-to-day lives, right? I think my place within these conversations, especially that Socratic Seminar, is really, right, like making sure that there is like an equity of voice, and that also, right, like students of color don't feel like they have to explain their humanity to like white students. But, you know, I think in those conversations there was definitely, you know, a lot of other really interesting topics came up, where like I noticed that, you know, some white students like had said some like colorblind comments, and I was like, okay, we need to follow up on this. We need to like look more deeply into like, you know, colorblind racism. And so then, right, like the following unit, that was kind of the end of the fall semester. The following unit, we started with the framework of the four I's of oppression and resistance. The four I's being ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized, and kind of like talking about how these four I's manifest both in real life but also in literature.
Right.
Mm. I feel like I was just in your class. I'm not gonna lie. You detailed that really well. I'm just kind of like, if I was sitting in a Socratic seminar like that, jeez. I mean,
Right.
those are heavy conversations. I mean, it's really one thing I think that sometimes we neglect to talk about, at least the way that we've been interviewing, is kind of like the teacher's perspective and position within those very difficult conversations. And so for you to bring up, you know, where you feel your role is and how you manage that is really insightful for all of us.
Yeah, and I think it's hard being an ethnic studies teacher and being a culturally responsive and teacher all the time, but especially right now during a pandemic, right? Because, you know, on one hand, I think oftentimes my students will always say, and this is, you know, even before I got the role at SOTA, right? It was like, oh, why do we always have to read like depressing stuff? Because like, I mean, a lot of literature is really, really depressing, whether or not it's, you know, exploring institutional racism and white supremacy, right? Like a lot of good literature is really sad. And they're always like, oh, can't we read like a happy book for once? And I'm like, well, also happy books don't make for good literature. Not universally true, but and so I think like right now one of my challenges actually as a teacher, right, like we're actually starting off the systems and power unit in a couple of weeks, and I'm really struggling on how to frame it, right? And I think being really mindful of the fact that it's like, it's been a very depressing year. You know, we've had a pandemic, we've had like a variety of, you know, recorded instances of white supremacy and institutionalized violence, you know, and we have like an upcoming election. And so like, I'm thinking also of how to, you know, bring in these really important conversations while also trying to instill some hope and positivity, because so much of distance learning is just such a drag. Right. And I really don't think it's actually very responsive of me right now to get on camera and be like, okay, today we're going to talk about the school to prison pipeline. Like, I don't know. I mean, I'm really struggling with that right now, actually. You know, my ethnic studies class, which is my upper level elective, right, for 11th and 12th graders, we're starting a unit called The Legacy of Slavery in a couple of weeks. And last year it was a unit where we read a novel called Homegoing by Jesse, which kind of details, I think it's 14 different narratives through, from the 1400s all the way up until the present, of what the ramifications are of slavery within, from one generation to the next.
Right.
And that book is so good, but so heavy, and then we watched 13th, which is a documentary that, explains in detail like how mass incarceration has become, the law of the land in some ways in this country. And so right now I just don't feel comfortable, right? Like having students digest this material on their own and then like talk about it via Zoom, where already we're having so many difficulties actually getting into in-depth discussions and being able to hold space for that, right? And thinking about how like a lot of the work that I teach and a lot of the materials that I teach in class, it can be really triggering, right? Like for students, who have experienced institutionalized violence themselves, or who have lost family members to police brutality and white supremacy, right? Like how do I hold space for these conversations while so that students and so that young people are aware and educated on these really important systemic issues, but also how do I make them feel empowered, and like give them hope. And that's just been the hardest challenge right now during distance learning. So it's something that I'm trying to navigate. I think everything I just described is something that worked really well in person when I was able to hold those healing spaces. I was able to check in with students who felt triggered during discussion, but right now I just don't know that I can really do that. And so I think my role as an ethnic studies teacher and has to shift and has to respond to this pandemic.
This next question that we have, it's what do you think the biggest impediments to implementing ethnic studies education, especially now that we have legislation coming in to make it a requirement? So what do you think are some struggles in there?
I think one of the biggest challenges would be training. I think a lot of, I think, again, like back to what I was describing earlier in the interview, folks who are more recently trained, whether or not it's specifically being trained to teach ethnic studies, have a lot more of this framework and vocabulary and pedagogy, right? And so I think a lot of younger folks would be really, really psyched to teach. And by younger folks, I don't mean like younger age-wise, but I mean like younger in terms of experience. I think they would be really excited to teach a course like ethnic studies. I think, when it comes to veterans, though, I think there's a lot of pride that comes with being a veteran, right? And being like, well, I've done this. I've done it like this for several years, and we could obviously argue that like saying something like we've always done it this way is not the best approach to growth. But I think that implementing ethnic studies in all grades would mean that a lot of teachers would have to attend additional training, and I think that a lot of current teachers, right, veteran teachers, would have to attend additional training, and I think that would be met with a lot of resistance by veteran teachers. Not across the board, but I could imagine that could definitely happen.
Right.
I think the other challenge, one possible challenge that I foresee would be like possible like family, parents and guardians backlash to this. Yeah, I actually talk about ethnic studies being a requirement in my class, and we have these conversations, right? Like I had them watch like a little video where, you know, the person who wrote the legislation for for ethnic studies being a requirement in CSUs
Mm-hmm.
was interviewed, and so you know, students watched that and kind of learned a little bit more about the current fight for ethnic studies within like CSUs and in California in general.
Right.
What I also found on the internet as I was looking for these, instructional materials is, more right wing material that's like, they're trying to indoctrinate our students with this anti-American sentiment, blah blah
Yeah.
blah, and like this curriculum is anti-Semitic. Like why don't they talk about the Holocaust?
Mm,
And like I think that there is like valid critique there that like I guess in one of the early drafts of the model curriculum, anti-Semitism was not named as like an example of systemic oppression, and I
mm,
think that that's a valid critique, but
yeah.
I don't think that it's a valid critique to say that ethnic studies is anti-Semitic.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that ethnic studies as a whole field of study is anti-Semitic,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, a lot of my students actually want to talk about Palestine, and they want to talk, and a lot of my Jewish students want to talk about Palestine, and so there's a lot more nuance than the way that I think ethnic studies as a requirement is currently being presented in the media, as I
Mm-hmm.
understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so I could foresee a lot of parent and guardian resistance to that if
Mm-hmm.
those happen to be, some of the mediums that, some of the information that they're accessing about ethnic studies as a requirement. Um, I actually asked this question to my students, right? I asked them like, what is a con of making ethnic studies a requirement?
Mm-hmm.
And so there were a couple of students who said that, making it a requirement might make it feel kind of like PE and health does, where, you have a few seniors who are now taking PE and health as part of their graduation requirement, and they absolutely hate it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, they were kind of arguing, like, we don't want ethnic studies to become that, where it becomes a requirement, and then students, people aren't actually excited to come to class.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's definitely a lot of food for thought. Mm,
Those are valid. Yeah.
yeah. It reminds me of the movie Precious Knowledge and the move in with the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, Arizona, and
Yeah.
how they got their backlash from politicians were that yes, it was like anti-Semitic and um, you're dividing children by what they look like, and all of that. Those points that they were making. Um, yeah, and I can definitely see the pushback and potentially having that same reactions to making it a requirement here.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I didn't even think of that. I didn't even think of parents. I think it's because my mom was like, not. Okay.
I mean, I don't have it with me right now, but I got this book from Rethinking Schools called Rethinking Ethnic Studies.
Yeah.
And one of the articles on there, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's called 6 Reasons Why I Want My White Children to Take Ethnic Studies.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been meaning to do this. I keep on forgetting, and now that we've talked, maybe I'll remember. But actually, like, I scanned this article and I was like, I want to send this to parents because I think
Oh yeah.
it's really helpful for them to understand, like, the benefits of taking ethnic studies. I mean, for everyone, right?
Right. Yeah, and that definitely puts, if it's written like in the perspectives of a parent, then maybe it'd be able to easier to digest for them and kind of see that point of view.
Exactly.
How do you suggest that students like us and people watching this video practice ethnic studies on a daily basis, being mindful of others' cultures in our current social and political climate, where open narratives about ethnic experiences have historically been disregarded?
Yeah, I think one of the most valuable pieces of vocabulary that I've been able to share with my students is this, idea of the dominant narrative and the counter narrative, and really analyzing, what the effects of the dominant narrative or the master narrative, depending on what text you read or how you frame it, right? Like how those dominant narratives, can really impact the communities that are historically marginalized and historically oppressed, right? And so I have an assignment that's titled a counter narrative poem, where students, are then able to kind of like tell, kind of talk back to these stereotypes and talk back to the dominant narrative, and frame narratives that are more authentic and more nuanced than the ones that are widely available in your history textbook, or even on Fox News or whatever, right, mainstream channel you're watching. And I think the biggest thing would be to, like keep humanization at the center, and keep like solidarity at the center. And I think so much of ethnic studies really is about like humanizing other people, and like understanding that, that yes, we can look different, and yes, we can have different upbringings, but we are all human beings, and we have that in common. And we all have like basic needs, and that I don't know, like we all have more universal needs, right? Whether it be like food, shelter, but like love, right? Under empathy, like those are all things that can connect us. And I think at its core, right, I think ethnic studies, and really any other discipline that is culturally relevant and culturally responsive, will address, right, like who we are as human beings, and having us understand one another on a deeper level.
Definitely. Yeah, that was a good last like speech right there. That was really good. Okay, well, that's all we have for you. Did you have anything that you wanted to ask us on, or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just wanted to learn a little bit more of the project that y'all are doing, and just kind of try to understand a little bit more of the rationale of what y'all are doing. And
yeah, for sure. Michaela does all the outreach, and then I have been managing this project. And the reason why we decided to do this was because both her and I and another one of our colleagues have taken ethnic studies at City College. And we saw this opportunity to kind of insert like experiences of educators through this process, because we were notified about the AB 331 coming through legislation, or actually it has already gone through, so it's being amended, right, again. So what we wanted to do was sort of insert this like extra piece of files of interviews that we have had with educators, to really hear like what somebody who actually teaches it and somebody who actually lives it, how that translates to their lives and the lives of the students that they teach.
Yeah, and that's such an example of a humanizing narrative in and of itself, right? So that's amazing. Well, thank you all so much for all the work that you're doing. And actually, it was like really nice to like talk about my experiences, because it was like, oh yeah, at one point in my life, I was actually a really good teacher, but not during a pandemic. But...
That's so not true. That's so not true. And that's not even us inflating your ego. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really enjoy talking to you today.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.